Discover over 100 episodes of Bartholomew Town on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
When I was still a sports writer in the late 80s at the Journal, there was a reporter had a backyard barbecue one summer night, and we're all sitting around the fire pit in our shorts and T-shirts, and Buddy pulls up in the chauffeured limousine in his suit after making the rounds, and he sits down by the fire pit and he hangs out until well past midnight. He's one of the last people to leave. So he embraced that. He liked that back and forth with reporters, and he played reporters like a violin, to get his word out and to, undermine his enemies.
Welcome in to another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Bartholomew. On today's episode, my conversation with veteran journalist and author Mike Stanton. Mike, well known in Rhode Island and well beyond, of course, as a longtime investigative reporter for the Providence Journal and as the author of The Prince of Providence, one of the premier deep dives into the world of Buddy Cianci, which is it's now actually being made into a play this upcoming season at Trinity Rep right here in Providence. So fascinating dichotomy of opinion when it comes to Buddy Cianci. Of course, the recent removal of the short-lived Buddy Cianci portraits from rooms in the now Graduate Hotel. That's the former Biltmore, of course, where Cianci resided for many years. And, you think about the fascination with the Crime Town podcast and so on and so forth. And now, obviously, this play at Trinity. And yet, at the same time, a lot of outrage. The legacy of Buddy Cianci and that Jekyll and Hyde effect, it never goes away. I mean, you'll find very few people who are more polarizing, at least in Rhode Island, that's for sure, certainly in Providence. So we talked a lot about that, Mike Stanton and I, in this episode you'll hear, but we also covered a lot of other ground, a fun episode with a veteran storyteller. Support for Bartholomew Town comes from High Hope, located at 38 Broadway in downtown Newport, Rhode Island. Discover more at highhoperi.com. And you can support the pod by subscribing, rating, and reviewing on your favorite app. All right, without further ado, my conversation with Mike Stanton.
Well, I always loved to read and tell stories when I was a kid. I grew up outside of Hartford, Connecticut, in Windsor Locks. And I came to Providence in 1985 to work for the Journal. I had a calling, when I was in high school, college, that I loved newspaper writing. And it was a pretty viable thing back then. And so I landed at the Providence Journal. And I had a plum job. I was the Providence College basketball beat writer.
Nice.
And I was hired the week before Rick Pitino was hired as the coach. So that was a pretty memorable run. I covered him for 2 years. He took the team to the Final Four. I was a sports writer for 5 years. I had a blast. A lot of big stories. I helped cover the Red Sox in the World Series when the ball went through poor Bill Buckner's legs.
R.I.P.
That was John McNamara's fault. He was a real asshole. I did not like him as a writer covering him. But in any event, before I came here, I'd worked for the Associated Press in various places as a news reporter. So when the Journal hired me, they liked that I had a hard news background for sports. And then in 1990... if you recall, there was a big banking crisis. Oh, you probably don't recall.
Well, I had Sunland we were talking about it as I had Sunland as a professor, I've heard about it extensively, and then have since gone back to really dig into that.
So it was like a mini Great Depression in Rhode Island. Yeah. It was a huge story at the Providence Journal, and the Journal, surprisingly, they had reporters who did investigative reporting, but they had disbanded their old investigative reporting team. And they kind of assembled it again to cover the banking crisis. Mm-hmm. And I had an editor who oversaw me in sports who pulled me out of sports and put me on it because I had just done a series about the finances of the Big East basketball conference. And I'd gotten these IRS forms that nonprofit colleges have to file. And I used that to find out how much all the coaches were making. And then when the banking crisis hit, my editor said, well, we want to get those forms for the credit unions. So you did that, so why don't you come over and help us out for a few months?
That's fascinating.
And that basically led to a permanent posting as a member of the investigative team. And we won a Pulitzer Prize in 1994. And then later, some of the other people on that team moved on to bigger papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. And I had opportunity to move on myself, a job offer from the Wall Street Journal, but I was really too enmeshed in Providence at the time. And I became the head of the investigative team instead, and then Operation Plunderdome broke. Actually, early on in Plunderdome was when I was offered a job by the Wall Street Journal. And I actually accepted it on a Friday, and then I had second thoughts, and I called back on Monday and turned it down.
Really?
And I went on to cover Plunderdome, and I had it in the back of my mind at the time that I wanted to write this book about Buddy Cianci, and I knew that if I went to the Wall Street Journal, that was never going to happen because I'd be at the bottom of the rung again, and I'd be, running that rat race and commuting from Boston or moving away. So I stayed and wrote The Prince of Providence instead.
Right. Seized the smaller market, I guess took it by the horns and then went. The story of Cianci became the defining face of Providence in the last 20, 30 years in a lot of ways. You're the guy.
He was. And what fascinated me about him, Bill, was originally when I started to cover him for the Journal and decided to write a book, I figured it would be 90% about Operation Plunderdome, and I would have a couple of early chapters about his first time as mayor in the 70s and the early corruption and the fireplace log and all that stuff. But then as I dug deeper into the history of Providence, I realized that all history is biography, and Providence really is a fascinating place, and its history all the way back to Roger Williams' founding in 1636. And so I really did a lot of that history. And the first half of the book is, takes place before we even get to Operation Plunderdome.
Right, really sets it up. Barney B. Evans was just on here. He described Providence as the first sanctuary city, that was Roger Williams' intent to build it as that. And we've just been building on that notion forever, getting warped with language. But
sure,
in a lot of ways, that allowed for the conditions to, manifest, that allowed for the post-bloodless revolution, Rhode Island, in a sense,
Yeah, I call it America's first safe house because Roger Williams was about to get, deported back to England by the Puritans in Massachusetts for his heretical beliefs. So he snuck out of town one night and he fled down here across the Providence River, and he called it Divine Providence because it was a place for him to, build this new idea of a colony with religious freedom.
Right.
And because of that wide open tolerance, all the free thinkers and scalawags and people from, who didn't conform all kind of gravitated to Rhode Island. We had a thriving Jewish population in colonial times. And then some not so good things, a lot of land speculators, sharp merchants, slave traders. And later, of course, the Industrial Revolution took root here in Pawtucket, and that led to the wave of immigration that transformed not only Rhode Island, but the whole country. So I always saw Rhode Island as a microcosm in a lot of ways. And then that gave us Buddy Cianci, who was the classic machine politician and really built an outsized image that made him a national figure, which is ridiculous when you think about a mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, the former armpit of New England, being a national figure. But there he is, sitting in the Oval Office with Gerald Ford. There he is giving a major speech at the Republican National Convention. There he is, a regular on the Don Imus national radio show.
Yep.
An inspiration for a character on Saturday Night Live, John Lovitz's pathological liar. And the list goes on and on.
Fascinating. And Cianci is, it's a dichotomy. I've heard you speak to this before, even surrounding the issue of the elephants at the zoo, where he named the elephant after, told like a 5-year-old girl he named the elephant after, and then at the same time he kicked the elephant when he had a dignitary in there at late night and he was drunk. That's the Jekyll and Hyde version that Torres spoke of, that's been presented to us, and we have to face that every day, even in this building that we're in right now. Mm-hmm. I'm only here because of my wife, and are only here because of a Cianci artist tax stabilization agreement. So you have to go, wow, that's innovative way of doing business. Mm-hmm. At the same time, who missed out on a fair shot to get a piece of property because of that?
Yeah, there's always that hand washing, kissing the ring, giving a taste, contributing to the campaign. But a lot of people did it willingly because they were either afraid not to or they got something out of it.
What was your relationship like with Buddy? Did you have a positive exchange with him, throughout the long-term exchange over the years?
Surprisingly, yes, we did until the book was published.
Got it.
He was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I saw it personally. I was around him. He liked hanging around reporters.
Yeah.
When I was still a sports writer in the late 80s at the Journal, there was a reporter had a backyard barbecue one summer night, and we're all sitting around the fire pit in our shorts and T-shirts, and Buddy pulls up in the chauffeured limousine in his suit after making the rounds, and he sits down by the fire pit, and he hangs out until well past midnight. He's one of the last people to leave. So he embraced that. He liked that back and forth with reporters, and he played reporters like a violin, to get his word out and to, undermine his enemies. But I also saw the dark side, especially when Plunderdome was going on, and I was digging into the unsavory side of his life, and he found out that I had a book contract, and he was furious because he saw it as a loss of money and a loss of control, the two things that meant most to him. So he tried to shut me out. He tried to browbeat me at press conferences and other public events. He told people don't talk to him, and which is not uncommon. I mean, Robert Cairo, the great biographer of Lyndon Johnson and Robert Moses, who built New York, basically faced the same kind of obstacles. But so we had a real love-hate relationship. And he was obviously not a fan of the book, and he criticized it to the extent he talked about it at all. When it was published when he was in prison, and when he got out of prison, he was pretty unhappy with it. And then he published his own book, Politics and Pasta, and I saw him. I didn't see a lot of him, but I saw him during that campaign. I believe it was 2014 when he ran for mayor. That last gasp. When he lost,
he still cares. He never stopped caring about.
He never
Providence,
stopped caring again.
Yeah.
And so I ran into him actually at the PPAC. There was a gala for the opening of the documentary about Bruce Sunland's World War II experience. Yeah. And Buddy showed up at that, and we had kind of what I call a cordially hostile conversation in which he kind of, egged me on. He talked a little bit about his strategy and how everybody was going to vote for him because, he went to their Little League games when they were kids, and now they were all grown up. But the sad truth is most of the people that lived in Providence when he ran in 2014 hadn't lived in Providence when he was mayor the last time.
Right, at closest Johnston and North Providence, but it's spread out much further than that. Do you feel like Cianci and his peer group around him, they didn't anticipate how rapidly the city's demographics had already changed and were changing, and that played a part? It was a naivety based on just not realizing how much it had shifted out from under him?
No, Buddy knew, even at the end. I mean, he was a shrewd vote counter, and he knew elections, he knew demographics. If you look at because he was mayor over different points in time, the different coalitions he would build to get elected. And in the 90s and early 2000s, he saw the growing Latino vote in Providence, and he embraced that. And he did things to cater to it. And in his last election, he really tapped into the African-American community and got a lot of support there. Yeah. But there just wasn't, he was running against, Jorge Elorza, a Latino candidate. And I remember going to an old Italian barber shop in the Mount Pleasant area. And there was this old Italian barber, and you walk in, you feel like you're back in the 50s with the old posters, and he's talking, "Oh, Buddy, I remember Buddy. Buddy's great. Buddy's great." And I said, "Well, where do you live?" He goes, "I live in Johnston." Yeah. And right next door in the same building is a Guatemalan bakery that had "Vote for Jorge Elorza" signs up.
Yeah, there it is. Perfect example of how it really ended for him in a lot of ways.
But I think he got what he wanted, Bill.
Yeah.
And I think I talked to somebody close to him when he was weighing whether to run that last time for mayor. This guy told Buddy about this mayor of Providence in the 1800s who died in office, and they laid him out in state at City Hall. And Buddy was really captivated by that image. And I think he saw that, like, I'm going to run, I'm going to get back into office, I'm going to be vindicated. And he knew he had cancer at the time. And, I'm sure deep down he knew that he probably wasn't going to outlive it. but he saw himself dying in office and being laid out in state and vindicated. And he did get that part of it. They did lay him out in state at City Hall, and he had the horse-drawn carriage up Atwell's Avenue on a snowy day.
Yep. Fascinating stuff. I mean, it'll never get old, really. I mean, it'll be one of those it'll be a chapter in every Rhode Island book, no matter how long the book gets or, how focused it gets. It'll always be there. And even nationally, you think that the comparison to Trump recently on Meet the Press, I can't remember who said it, but
that's right.
It's not going anywhere.
Well, Buddy does have a cult following among people around the country, especially national political people and journalists. And I find a lot of people, when they move to Rhode Island, someone gives them a copy of The Prince of Providence, says, you got to read this to understand Providence and get a taste for the history and the culture. So I'm proud of that. That was something I was trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so let's speak to that. Obviously, there's the new, the Trinity is potentially where they've bought the rights to the play. Are they actually working on
happening.
it? It's happening.
It's the
really
debut
happening.
September 22nd. It's going to kick off their
so I totally
season.
was asleep on the wheel on that one.
Yeah, well, it moved fast.
Okay.
It was only about a year ago, last spring, that they officially acquired the stage rights.
Yeah.
And usually that's a longer process to develop. And they got a playwright named George Brandt, who's an award-winning playwright. He did Into the Breaches. That was a great show at Trinity a year and a half ago. And he cranked out a draft from last spring to last summer. He had a first draft written. We went to a table reading at Trinity last August. And he's reworked it, and they announced earlier this spring that it's going to kick off their 2019-2020 season.
Wow, that's incredible. Are tickets available yet, or?
Yeah, yes and no. I think I'm not sure what the official word is. Tickets are selling fast. They're not sold out. I think at this point you can't buy individual seats unless they're trying to get you to buy a season subscription.
Yeah, right.
I think. But I wouldn't sleep on that because I'm already getting calls from people about is it sold out? Can I get tickets?
Yeah, no, that's a huge thing for sure.
Yeah.
When it comes to kind of working back into the living in as an author of this really fundamental book within Rhode Island, within inside politics, inside baseball on a national level, how does that change your career? Your standing and reputation are enhanced by this one piece of work. How has that changed the way you go about business?
Well, I'm laughing because I remember Buddy was yelling at me one day, and he says, he only wrote one book, and he wouldn't have written the book without me. He couldn't have written that book without me.
Right.
And I said, well, that's true, Buddy, but I have written 2 books now.
Yep.
But certainly the book helped position me to do other things that I wanted to do. It helped position me to become a journalism professor at the University of Connecticut, where I just got tenure last month. And it positioned me to write my second book, Unbeaten, the story of Rocky Marciano, which actually I was led to that through Buddy's story, because when Buddy grew up in Providence in the 1940s and early 50s, Rocky Marciano was the headliner at the old Rhode Island Auditorium, and Buddy's father would take him to the fights. And Buddy, like a lot of people in Providence, especially Italian Americans, came to idolize Rocky Marciano, the rising soon-to-be heavyweight champion. So that culture fascinated me when I was researching Buddy's childhood and what Providence was like and what America was like and the central role that boxing played and just all the colorful characters. I remember hearing a story about a fight where a couple, after the fighters, finished a controversial decision, their families jumped into the ring and they all started brawling.
No way! Wow.
And you had, Colonel Stone, the future head of the state police, was then a Providence police officer. He jumped into the ring and was throwing bodies aside, breaking up the fight. And you had wise guys there. I talked to one guy whose uncle was a bookie and a driver for Raymond Patriarca, and his uncle would take this guy and his teenage friends to the fights and get them in front row seats. And while they're watching Rocky fight in the ring, Uncle Mike is up in the back with Raymond Patriarca and all the other bookies taking action on the fights. And as one guy said, that's why the judges had pencils with erasers, because sometimes decisions would take a strange twist of fate.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's just a colorful culture.
Yes, supremely. And boxing is not something anywhere close to what it was then as far as its cultural relevance. Do you think, as a baseball guy, do you think baseball, football will shift the way boxing has gone in 20, 30 years? We're going to see something new come along, whether it's esports or something else? I mean, is that parallel there as well?
I don't know. I think the parallels are there strong with football because of the concussions.
Yeah.
And all the injuries. And what I found when Rocky Marciano was fighting, and he was one of the hardest punching heavyweights in history. Somebody measured the force of his punch is equivalent to the force of a bullet fired from a gun. And it caused a lot of damage, boxing. And Rocky was kind of this rough, tough guy from Brockton, high school dropout, classic fighter profile. But he had this presence of mind that surprises people. And he saw late in life, he saw the damage that was done to fighters. And fighters were dying in the ring, just like football players today are getting, brain damaged. And people were really starting to recoil from it. And then there was a lot of corruption. The mafia controlled the sport, and Rocky's manager was controlled by the mob. And you couldn't really make it to the heavyweight championship without the mob getting their fingers in there. And they owned a piece of Rocky. And he hated it. He knew it. He hated it. He resented it. And it was an ironic thing for him because he's a proud Italian-American, but he knows that mob image kind of soils the Italian reputation. And yet he was also fascinated by these wise guys and hung around them, especially in retirement. And he did deals with them. But late in his life, he actually said to a British writer, he was in London, and he said, 50 years from now, boxing is going to go away, and we're the last of the gladiators. It's just too savage a sport to survive in a civilized world.
What's the draw for you? The biggest draw of teaching at UConn now that you're tenured? Congratulations, that's one draw for sure.
Yeah.
But the interaction with students. I mean, is that That must
the
be
students keep you young, and they give you hope for the future of journalism at a dark time. And I know a lot of people ask me, and sometimes I ask myself, well, how can you justify teaching students to go into this profession where jobs are evaporating? And it's scary to see. But by the same token, our hunger for news and journalism is not going to go away and is needed more than ever. And the students today, they have a hunger for it. And they're still fighting. They still want to get involved in journalism, and the profession is evolving. And I tell my students that you're helping build the bridge to the future.
Right.
And we don't know what platform it's going to take, but it's going to be there. And our students are getting jobs. And I remember when I came out of journalism school in the early 80s, my first job, I was making $190 a week for a little newspaper in New Jersey. So there is a certain amount of dues paying that goes on.
Definitely. It's sort of like any other creative profession, I think, or experimental profession, startup, technology, whatever it is. You have to be willing to take a bath, at some level.
Yeah, you have to follow your passion and your dream. And I don't want to give rose-colored, advice that it's all going to work out and you're all going to make it to the New York Times or ESPN or CBS or whatever your ultimate goal is. I mean, I had the usual dream when I was a young journalism student that I was going to go to the New York Times or the Washington Post, and I never made it to those papers, but I've enjoyed my career, and it took unexpected detours, and that's kind of the fun of being a journalist, is you never quite know where the story is going to take you, but if you enjoy the journey and telling the story, then that's the fun of it. Yeah,
it's humongous.
Yeah.
Rhode Island local media, we're seeing huge shifts right now with the Boston Globe making the play, the three reporters that have been the staff reporters now, Dan McGowan, Amanda Milkovits, and Ed Fitzpatrick. We're also seeing the Publix Radio flirt with expansion, or they've announced they're expanding to Newport and to South County with a Westerly bureau. That kind of mimics, in a way, the old Journal bureau.
Yeah.
The Journal, on the other hand, last week we saw more people
more
losing
cuts.
their jobs. You wonder what's going on in television. Who's the real audience in television news? That's who is it that's watching that? And there's a lot of questions surrounding that. So here in Rhode Island, where do you think and of course talk radio is a whole nother animal as well. But when you look at Rhode Island right now, where do you see the main players in media going forward?
Wow. It's hard. I mean, the decline of the Providence Journal is a real blow to the state of Rhode Island. Even people that hate journalists or don't realize how important it is. It's kind of like a loved one who you don't appreciate until they're gone, or they go into their health declines rapidly. And I think all these other things you see are a response to that and a response to the shifting landscape. You see more people giving to Rhode Island, Publix Radio, it's called now.
Yeah.
and you see the Boston Globe coming in, and everybody's very intrigued by that. And the Globe recently became, the first non-national paper, outside of the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, to actually have more digital than print subscribers. And it's making money. And this play into Rhode Island is very interesting, and it's clear to me that they're not looking to do an old dead tree newspaper, Rhode Island edition, and print it and bring the trucks down to Rhode Island and distribute it. They're looking to, build that digital audience. And I'd be interested. I was actually just talking to, Dan McGowan the other day, and I said I'd be interested to know, are there any studies like from the Massachusetts Transit Authority about how many people live in Rhode Island and commute to Boston for work? I have friends that work at the Boston Globe, not in this new Rhode Island startup, who commute to Boston, and I know other people that do as well.
Yep.
So there is that connection, and my dream, and I don't think this is realistic, but my fantasy, I'll say, would be for John Henry, the owner of the Boston Globe, whose wife is the publisher of the Globe and has made this push, and he's independently wealthy and owns the Red Sox. My dream would be for the Journal to shrivel up like it is, and then he comes in and buys it.
Right.
But I'm not sure that's true. And the other thing is you have this absentee ownership, and Gatehouse Media owns the Journal, and they're controlled by these, Wall Street types who are just looking at the bottom line, and their track record around the country is not good. And they talk the talk about local journalism, but I don't see them walking the walk. And unfortunately, when they bought the Journal a few years ago, there was a local group that tried to buy it. And
Buck
Gatehouse,
Chase and a couple others, right?
Yeah. And Gatehouse outbid them. And the reason Gatehouse could outbid them was because they wanted this synergy. They wanted the Journal's printing plant, and they wanted to use it to print all their other local papers like Fall River, Brockton, Newport, and so on. So they were able to pay a premium for it. And that's why my fantasy will probably not be fulfilled, because they'll hang on to that printing press. But who knows? I mean, if they're bottom feeders, like a lot of their critics say, and they're just going to squeeze every last dollar out of the Journal until there's nothing left to squeeze, then maybe they turn around and they dump it in a fire sale. I don't know. The future is very unclear.
That could be really interesting. Yeah, I've wondered that. You think about the attempted acquisition of the Biltmore Hotel back in the day by the Journal and some other institutions. You wonder who's positioned to scoop up the Journal today from Gatehouse, but it is a part of this really bland website network. It's not good. It's not an entertaining space either. So that makes it that much more disappointing that it's in decline, and it's
sad because the Journal used to be the 800-pound gorilla.
Yeah,
they owned a series of something like 30 TV stations across the country, including Washington D.C., New Orleans, Seattle, like major markets. They owned a little cable channel called the Food Network, and they owned actually a piece of the Philadelphia Phillies baseball team.
Wow! And
Michael Metcalf, who was like a scion of the old Metcalf family that owned the Journal going back to the 1800s. He was kind of a visionary leader, and then not long after I got to the Journal in the 1980s, he died in this very tragic accident where he fell off his bicycle at his summer house in Westport, Massachusetts, and died of head injuries a week later. And that really shifted the fortunes of the company, because he was a young, dynamic vision. I think he was in his 50s at the time, who would have probably steered the company for years, and they would have been the ones buying up other properties. And just imagine the Providence Journal if they had today's Food Network in their portfolio, and the cash that could have potentially generated. But instead, there was no logical family member to take over for Metcalf, and that began the long road to ruin and absentee ownership.
Rhode Islanders are they're comfortable with a Journal in a way that they can't imagine it won't be there. It's just taken for granted. So, man, it would hopefully not be it hopefully won't be a thing that we wake up one day and there's no more Providence Journal.
Everyone says that. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's limping along, and maybe like we were just discussing, it'll get to the point where Gatehouse has no more use for it, and someone else will pick it up. But we can't expect that they're going to bring it back to the glory days of what it used to be.
Would you ever get back into the field, even though you're tenured, if the Globe called or the New Journal called and said, look, we're opening up the I-team?
Well, it's funny. The nice thing about my job at UConn is that I'm considered a research position, and they want me to do journalism. They want me to write books. I wrote this Rocky Marciano book, in my time at UConn. And now that I'm done with that, I have other projects I can pursue, and that, it can include investigative journalism.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing. Maybe, tenured professors in a research capacity, that could be a whole universe of I-team reporting, I suppose.
I talked to some people about that, and that is, there are all these new models out there, ProPublica and nonprofits and foundations, especially in our national political landscape. A lot of people are seeing the importance of solid journalism. They're recognizing the harm it's done to our society to have it fade away. And so you see some of these national institutions are really thriving. The New York Times, Washington Post, ProPublica. But what's really hurting is the local news. The Providence Journal used to have bureaus that covered every city and town in Rhode Island. They used to have, half a dozen people at the State House. They used to have, 4 people at Providence City Hall. And when you don't have those people watching the store, and that's a problem across the country, fewer eyeballs in state houses and city halls and town and local governments. And that has nothing to do with Republican versus Democrat. But that's a real blow. And I think TV news is doing okay. I think a lot of people get their local news from TV, partly because the vacuum of the decline of print.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how that translates to smartphones more and more going forward as well, TV news.
And the other thing is, when mid-sized papers like the Journal go down, it creates an opportunity for these local papers like the Valley Breeze, the Cranston Herald, the Warwick Beacon, because people want to read those papers to see what's going on in their towns, and they can't get that anymore in the Providence Journal.
Mike Stanton, anything coming up in the, obviously we've got Trinity, that's big. That's something to stay tuned into. I'm looking forward to that. And, we're actually talking about movie rights for Unbeaten, the Rocky Marciano story. And it was actually shortlisted for a prize as best sports book in Great Britain. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
I don't expect I'll win, but just to be shortlisted in the finalists with a book about the big book on Tiger Woods that came out last year, and a book about Messi, the soccer star.
That's huge.
So, good company.
Can't go wrong with that.
Yeah. And this is the 50th anniversary this summer of Rocky Marciano's death in a plane crash. So there's been a lot of attention about that.
Well, good luck with that. That'd be awesome to get that on the big screen.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that. That's for
right.
sure.
Look forward to it. And my dream, I think that, Peter Farrelly should step in and do the movie of The Prince of Providence. I think it's time for that to get done.
Let's have it. I'm into that.
And he'd be great. He'd be great.
Shoot it right here in Rhode Island, shut down the city for a couple of days. Really.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think Steve Feinberg from the Film Commission would be good with that.
All right, well,
maybe we can even get some scenes filmed in this building.
Hey, why not? Exactly.
Some body parts being cut up by some mob guys in the basement. And
absolutely, some cigarettes being extinguished on foreheads or whatever it is.
That's right.
I've got a whole lot coming up for you this summer. Stay tuned. Every Tuesday and Friday, new episodes, plus action over on Instagram at Bartholomew Town Podcast. Lots more coming. Thanks for listening today. Until next time, I'm Bill Bartholomew, and we'll talk soon.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.